Hello, this is John Rankin, johnrankin.us. Yes to honest politics. In this video, I want to read some excerpts from a book by the Reverend John Thomas Rankin, Letters on American Slavery, 1836. On the frontispiece is a picture, an artistically rendered picture of slave drivers chasing a black woman with her child across the frozen river between Kentucky and Ohio, escaping with her life. That's a real story from John Rankin's life, as she went to the top, aiming for the top of the hill where his house was, and known to be a place where runaway slaves could find solace. The Reverend John Thomas Rankin grew up in eastern Tennessee. He hated the fact it was a slaveholding state, went through Kentucky, a slaveholding state, and finally arrived in Ripley, Ohio. And over 44 years, though that was interrupted in 1851 by the Fugitive Slave Act, but he and his 7 sons helped escort 2,000 slaves to freedom in Canada, and therefore he was known as the manager of the Underground Railroad. And the life he lived was intellectually exciting. We'll talk about that here shortly. But also, with the slave catchers on one side of the river and the Underground Railroad on the other side of the river, and a couple of gun battles and false court hearings and so forth, he led a dynamically exciting life, not because he chose to, but because he was simply seeking to be faithful to the gospel in his hatred of slavery. And so I want to one day produce a film on this. And one great source for that is Anne Hagedorn's great book on John Rankin called Beyond the River, published about 2002, and by Simon & Schuster. I recommend highly that you track that book down and read it. You will be blessed. A movie could be done with no historical fiction, and that's not the right way to put it, no artistic liberty to go away from the historical basis we know of John Rankin's life. You'll be on the edge of your seats to see a movie of his life honestly profiled. Let me read a little bit from his letters on American slavery. So when his brother, one of his brothers in eastern Tennessee, bought a slave and told John Rankin was really upset. So he wrote him a series of letters, and eventually they were published in the Castigator, an abolitionist newspaper in Cincinnati, where Harry Beecher Stowe at that time lived. Let me read just a little bit from his preface. But little can be reasonably be hoped in relation to the success of this work, when it is considered that, in addition to the difficulties arising from its own imperfections, it must bear the charge of fanaticism and contend with prejudices that have been rapidly increasing for ages. In opposition to it, more than 10,000 envenomed tongues and pens dipped in the gall of unrelenting avarice may be expected to plead the cause of injustice. Now, as I read this here, I'm struck by the fact that he knew it was called fanaticism to advocate for the humanity of black people. Fanaticisms are always a charge laid at people pursuing justice in a society that has injustice. He continues, these difficulties, however, should be considered as so many arguments in favor of the work. If but a little good can be done, it is the more necessary that the little should be done. That involuntary slavery is a very dangerous evil, and that our nation is involved in it, none can, with truth, deny. And that the safety of our government and the happiness of its subjects depend upon the extermination of this evil must be obvious to every enlightened mind. Nor is it less evident that it is the duty of every citizen, according to his station, talents, and opportunity, to use suitable exertions for the abolition of an evil which is pregnant with the growing principles of ruin. And so here's a man who simply out of biblical conviction fought for the abolition of slavery. From various of his letters to his brother, let me share a few excerpts. One really interesting argument to me was how he argued for the fact that outward skin color had nothing to do with underlying reality. In the science of the time, he saw that very clearly. And here, part of a paragraph. Hence the Jews, who were doubtless originally all of the same complexion, and who never intermarry with the nations among whom they sojourn, are found to be white in Germany and Poland, swarthy in Spain and Portugal, olive in the Barbary states and in Egypt, and black in Hindustan, that is India. And hence a colony of Ethiopians who settled in Colchis on the Black Sea, 2,000 years ago have now become white, and the Portuguese, who settled 200 years ago since on the coast of Africa, black. So here he is arguing for the image of God in all people equally. We are all sons and daughters of Adam and Eve, and racial components are external alone and should have no currency in terms of defining the human worth. Continuing, he says here, another one of his letters, slavery interferes with all the social and relative duties. And what is still a more serious evil, it interferes with the divine prerogative over man and robs the Almighty the service which is due him from the creatures of his power. Antiquated language, what he's saying is, we owe our life to God, not to another person. And in slavery, another person enslaves you. In the sight of God, we are set free. Finally, and here he illustrates it, finally, every man desires to be free. And this desire, the Creator himself has implanted in the bosoms of all our race, and is certainly a conclusive proof that all were designed for freedom, else man was created for disappointment and misery. And then writing to his brother as a slaveholder, he says, how then can you withhold from others what is so dear to yourself? The Africans possess all the original properties of humanity and were, as we have fairly proven from their nature, created for freedom. And therefore to enslave them is both unjust and cruel. Let's flip to another one of his letters and take an excerpt. The longer I reflect upon involuntary slavery, the more I abhor it, as being a combination of the most flagrant injustice and cruelty. It makes an innocent man the property of another, who may, if he please, deprive him of all the comforts of life and subject him to 1,000 sufferings. This appears to me as most unjust and cruel, when I consider that the very best of men are fallen creatures, and as such naturally disposed to tyrannize over the subjects of their power. The history of the world is but one general display of tyrannical opposition. Every nation has been made to agonize beneath the weight of cruel despotism. Every sect or party that has in any age been vested with absolute power, whether civil or ecclesiastical, has manifested a strong tendency toward tyranny. Indeed, this is the case. There's only one source for freedom in all of human history, and that is Hebrew covenant in Genesis 1 and 2 and following. Every other form of government is a slide towards some form of tyranny. And therefore, the covenants of freedom in Genesis on following and the new covenant of Jesus is the only place in which freedom can be located. Picking up in another one of his letters, he says, speaking of the slave master, and thus he is permitted to tyrannize over the consciences of men, which is the worst of all tyranny. In other words, it's one thing to have your bodies enslaved, but to have your mind enslaved is far worse. And that is a tyranny that transcends all sorts of politics and history. It's just as much with us today as any time in history. In another one of his letters, slavery tends to tyranny. It is directly opposed to the fundamental principles of republicanism. And by republicanism, he's talking about representative government, checks and balances on power. Maintained in that part of the Declaration of Independence, which declares that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These principles are absolutely denied in the slave-holding states. He continues and says, not long thereafter, the truth is, all the slave-holding states do practically maintain the fundamental principles of absolute monarchy, which are that all men are not equal and that all men are not born equally free and independent. Every slaveholder is an absolute monarch and his slaves. And so who, even in our culture today, without the power of chattel slavery, nonetheless uses economics and intimidation to seek to enslave the minds of others and treat other people as second class? In all of human history, 1 or 2% are the self-appointed elitists who want to rule over everybody else. They need a sycophantry. They need a civil service and a military underneath them, whom they intimidate or pay off, whereas 90% of the rest of society is enslaved to them, and yet most people simply want to be free. There are always the minority self-appointed elitist who are the deposit of evil within the human scheme. They have ever had an unequitable representation in Congress, referring to blacks who were treated as 3/5 persons, so that their slave owners could have a voting representation to elect more white people in Congress of their disposition. And yet, 1858 Dred Scott decision refused to give the black man his freedom, his equality, his personhood, and it took, unfortunately, a civil war in this country. Now, because of the biblical rootedness of John Newton and William Wilberforce and the Clapham Society in England, they abolished the slave trade in 1807, and in 1833, they bought every slave out of slavery, and there was no bloodshed whatsoever. In the United States, we do not have such wisdom. In another letter, he says, "It must be admitted that all Africans and the rest of mankind have sprung from one common father, and consequently, all originally were alike free." A little bit down the page, "The right to freedom belongs to the Africans, and therefore it is as unjust to hold it from them as it is to hold stolen property from its rightful owner." And one final quote from John Rankin's book, Letters on American Slavery. "Now this is precisely the situation of the Africans you hold in servitude," writing to his brother. "Their ancestors were originally free, but were taken unjustly and sold into bondage, and by an unjust and arbitrary power their offspring are still enslaved. You suppose that you have a right to them by honest purchase, but they are the same as stolen property. The title to them was originally derived from the hand of the thief." Continuing, "And it is not freedom, more precious than property." When I was studying at Harvard in the 1980s, and I was studying feminist ethics, that's the subject of another video, I learned the verb to reify. To reify is to take a person and reduce them to property or concrete objects. It is the most disgusting thing that could be done to another human being in their dehumanization. Wherever we find this, those of us who are disciples of Moses or disciples of Jesus must say a resolute no, and therefore offer positive alternatives, a free and just society, which is the vision of the Emancipation Party. Thank you so much. This is John Rankin, johnrankin.us, and God bless.